Hello, good afternoon and welcome everybody to this webinar focusing in today on former tenant arrears. My name's Peter Hudson. I'm the sales director at Voicescape, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's session. We're going to just let a few more people filter in. I think about the numbers are creeping up every second actually, so I'm not going to give a running count, but needless to say, it's a really well subscribed series. We've got about 120 UK social landlords registered for both today's event and the event that's running in September as well. We've run it over 2 days to allow people to go on summer holidays and still participate. So just looking now, we've got Marlon from L&Q. Hello, Marlon. We've got Melody from Clwyd-Alyn, so touching all corners of the UK here. Laura from Sovereign, Emily from Optivo, Nathan at Cambridge. Hello. Julie from Somerset West and Taunton. Steph at Peaks and Plains. So hello to everyone. Sorry, I'm not going to be able to say everybody's name, but welcome everybody. So do use the chat, say hello to the rest of the group. Ros from Catalyst, hello Ros, not spoken in a while. So today we'll be discussing former tenant arrears. It's a really hot topic right now. In fact, we ran a poll on social media in this week to understand what people's strategy around collecting former tenant debt is. The results are a bit interesting actually. So 5% of respondents said that they had a full former tenant arrears collection strategy, just 5%. 35% said that they do it ad hoc and when kind of resources permit. And 60% of people said they had no strategy at all. So interesting to see what other people's thoughts on that are. Maybe just leave a comment in the chat. My colleague Mohammed Sheikh is in the chat, so leave any comments for him to have a look through. Bit of housekeeping. The live storm system, you'll notice up at the top you've got 3 tabs. You've got chat that we've just discussed, so leave any comments in there. We've got questions, so all of the speakers will be available to take your at the end, so just to help them do a bit of preparation, please do leave some questions in that section and they'll be covered at the end. And we'll also be running 2 polls throughout this session as well. So the first one I think should be live now. Let me just have a quick look. Yeah, so the first poll is live right now, and what we're trying to understand here is what people are expecting. Compared to last year, is 2022 going to be a more challenging year for former tenant arrears collections than last? So feel free to submit your vote there and we'll have a look at those results towards the end. We will be recording today's session, so at the end of this, we'll be sending a message out to you with a link to the full recording. So no need to take notes, I suppose, you can concentrate fully. But without further ado, we've got 3 fantastic guests today. We'll be joined by, firstly, my colleague Chris Walker. He's our behavioural scientist lead. And what he's going to be exploring is why former tenants behave like they do. And because of that, you know, with that knowledge, what can technology do to drive some more positive engagements and empower officers? Secondly, Caroline Spiers from the 13 Group, and Caroline's going to be sharing their former tenant arrears strategy, looking at how Voicescape Collections has underpinned and empowered her team to deliver that strategy. And then Paula Jenner from Citizen, looking at their slightly different approach to former tenant arrears collections, looking at how technology and data have supported their strategy. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Chris and look forward to taking questions at the end and speaking with you all then. Thanks very much. Over to you, Chris.
Hi everyone, I'm Chris Walker. I'm the Behavioural Insights lead here at Voicescape, and I'm going to take you through a quick look at former tenant arrears collection through a behavioural science lens, so that we can try to understand why it is that former tenants aren't engaging and show how the use of technology can positively impact engagement. To do this, I'm going to use a behavioural science framework called BMAT to help structure our thinking around former tenant arrears. So BMAT was created by the founder of Stanford University's Persuasive Technology Lab, So not only is it a well-established model of human behavior, but its simplicity provides a really nice practical framework for thinking about behavior and how we can create effective behavior change interventions. So using the BMAT model allows us to identify the current in-context barriers that prohibit the target behavior that we're looking to change. It also facilitates executional ideas to steer people towards the desired behavior that we're looking for. And then finally, it also creates a framework for identifying and incorporating last mile nudges that prompt behavior change. So what this last benefit means is that it helps us to think of ways in which we can tweak or supplement our existing processes without having to make whole-scale process changes. So what does BMAT stand for, and how can we use it in the context of former tenant arrears? So essentially, BMAT is an equation which says that behavior requires three things. It requires motivation, it requires ability, and it requires a trigger. So when it comes to arrears collection for former tenants, we often think about behavior, the behavior in question, as paying off that arrear. However, before someone is in a position to make a payment towards their arrear, the first thing they do is they need to engage with us. Now, we can sometimes bundle these together so that we both achieve engagement and payment with one intervention, but oftentimes it'll take multiple engagements to secure that full payment. So it's useful to think of these behaviors as two separate problems. So thinking about motivation in relation to former tenant arrears engagement, we can start to drill down into some of the drivers of engagement from these tenants. So an obvious first example would be that landlord-tenant relationship. So what was their experience during their tenancy? Do they trust you as a landlord, and do they think of you as a fair landlord? But alternatively, we can think about it in terms of, are they sticking their head in the sand and trying to avoid dealing with the current situation? So why might this be? Do they feel ashamed? Are they worried about the consequences of engagement? Or is it that they're possibly not worried about the consequences of engagement? So do they feel that there'll be no impact if they just continue to not engage? And there's also the potential that they might have a misperception about what happens when you're no longer a tenant. It's possible that they see non-payment after you leave as normal, and by proxy, disengagement may also be seen as the norm. So similarly, we can also think about some of the ability reasons why tenants aren't engaging, along with these motivation reasons. So in terms of engagement, we can think of ability in terms of different ways. So we can think about it in terms of time. So this can be in relation to the length of the process, but it can also be in terms of how busy people are. So are we engaging at the right moment? We also want to think about ability in terms of ease. So for example, how easy is it for the tenant to speak to the right person to deal with their situation? So do they have to phone a general number and then speak to a customer services advisor, who will then pass them on to the income team, who will then redirect them to speak to the right person? So having multiple steps like this in the process makes it much less fluid. I'm sure we can all think of times when we've had this experience and it's left us feeling frustrated, and times when we've eventually been put through to the right person and it's been a much more difficult conversation than it might have otherwise needed to be, or times when we simply just didn't have the motivation to stay on the line and we would hang up the call. And then finally, the last sort of way of thinking about ability would be in terms of psychological capability of the individual who's engaging. So financial hardship is stressful, and this impacts our decision-making. So tasks or processes that might be seen as easy to do under normal circumstances can become much more difficult or daunting or even anxiety-provoking. Again, what we want to do is simplify these and make the behavior as easy as we can to ensure that everyone has the psychological capability to action it. So for an engagement to be successful, we need to ensure that that motivation is high enough or that ability is high enough. But we also need that important third ingredient, which is an effective trigger. So we can think of two triggers that help to tackle the lack of motivation or ability, and then a third trigger that will help when both of these are sufficiently high enough. So when we've got sufficiently high motivation and sufficiently high ability. So the first trigger is a facilitator, which is when motivation is high but ability is low. So this trigger essentially provides a leg up to help people complete that behavior. So let's take that psychological capability example. So say if you've written a letter to the former tenant, providing them with all the details of their situation and steps they need to complete this, but the letter is 2 pages long and it's overly verbose. So it might provide everything that the tenant needs to know, but it also requires a lot of cognitive processing to sit down and read through this. So our brains typically prefer to function on autopilot if they can. So redesigning this letter to make it simple, using plain English and potentially using visuals to highlight important aspects will help this engagement act as a facilitator, because it makes completing that behavior much easier. Secondly, we can think of sparks. So these are the opposite of facilitators when motivation is low, but the ability is high. So I mentioned that tenants' motivation for engagement may be low because they may feel ashamed. So is there anything that we can do as part of our engagement techniques to try and minimize this feeling and let them know that they'll be supported and that you're there to help them when they get on that call? Finally, we have signals. So this is when motivation and ability are both high. Essentially, these functions as reminders or prompts. A lot of the time when we fail to do something, it's simply because we've forgotten, not because we don't want to or don't have the ability to engage. So creating simple reminders can be a great way to signal tenants of the behavior that they need to complete. So I mentioned at the start that I'd highlight how technology could impact engagement using this approach, and how BMAP provided a framework that allowed us to supplement existing processes without changing them root and branch. So I'll give you a quick example in relation to our collections for former tenant arrears technology. So one of the key benefits of this technology is it's able to cover all 3 types of triggers required to facilitate behavior change. So if we think firstly in terms of facilitator triggers, we can maximize issues of time, ease, and psychological capability by sending an outbound automated call at the right time that transfers the tenant directly to the person that they need to speak to, following a short and simple message that provides that tenant with a clear understanding about the context of the call. So in doing so, giving them that leg up to complete that behavior. Then in terms of sparks, to increase motivation, we can think about tailoring the messages of these automated calls to address those drivers of engagement. So I mentioned the example of tenants who may be feeling ashamed, but similarly, messages could be designed to address other drivers such as concerns over the consequences or the potential impacts or losses associated with continued disengagement, and then also messages that trigger that sort of social norms to realign any misperceptions they may have about non-payment or disengagement. And then finally, one of the advantages of using technology is the efficiency gain associated with staff not having to manually call tenants. Therefore, by virtue of being able to engage with large numbers with ease, many of these calls will act as signals themselves. They'll prompt tenants to engage who may have otherwise forgotten or had got distracted. Finally, before I pass over to some of our clients who are able to flesh out some of these ideas, the use of technology has its advantages beyond engaging with tenants. It can help to overcome some of the organizational issues around motivation and ability. So for example, I mentioned how technologies provide efficiencies which can help act as a signal for tenants. But similarly, this efficiency gain acts as a facilitator for organizations. It does so by reducing the labor-intensive duties of staff and therefore raising their ability to maximize engagement, and in this particular case, process payments for former tenants. And it does so by prioritizing their time and energy, allowing them to facilitate and prioritize actions that require that human touch rather than the duties that can be carried out by automation. And then finally, in terms of providing that spark, an increase in motivation by reducing these more boring or labor-intensive tasks, staff can prioritize having conversations with tenants who actually want to speak to them. So this also has positive benefits in terms of that landlord-tenant relationship, as staff have more time to fully engage with customers and create tailored solutions to their particular needs. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an overview of former tenant arrears collection through the lens of behavioural science, and gives you a framework for tackling your own former tenant arrears, as well as highlighting how technology can transform this process. I'll now pass over to some of our clients who can speak to their own experience of the benefits of using technology and hopefully expand on some of the points I've highlighted. Thank you.
Thanks for that. My name is Caroline Spiers and I am head of credit control here at 13. I've worked at 13 since 2014. That was from previous stock transfers from local authorities through various mergers, and now 13. So a total of 23 years housing and income experience from me. But today is all about former tenant debt arrears and how we have been able to use technology in supporting us maximising our income. When I was appointed in my current role in November 2018, I did a lot of research and collected lots of information around communicating with our customers. And I want to look at the how we were communicating, when we were communicating and why. And also a partnership working internally and where that all fits in together. So I started with the how, mainly our written communication, what was the structure of our letters and how effective were they. The letters weren't generating much response from customers. So I tried sending out invoices instead, see what reaction that would gain. I started to increase responses from customers. We then brought these invoice style demands for payment in line with the nudge theory that was in our letters, which lets customers know what will happen next if they don't pay and respond to how to pay, etc. As part of this research, I also needed to know the when. I analysed how far after the end of a tenancy we were likely to collect the debt. So from this, I created a heat map which showed that the debt was its hottest within 6 months of the customer leaving us. So that was when we were most likely to be able to collect it. After that, it was usually only when the customers were needing to be rehoused. To round off that research, I looked at the why. So why were we holding on to debt that we are unlikely to collect? I obtained some detailed data on our entire former tenant portfolio from Experian. This gave me the propensity ratings and likelihood of being able to collect the debt based on that customer's current circumstances. From these pieces of research, we changed the recovery process. Our aim is to engage and take payments and make arrangements with customers who leave us with debt within a 6-month period. We no longer send letters at all, only invoices. We have cut the waste out of our processes and try to pursue debt within its first 6 months. We're also able to use this research for leadership, which allowed us to clear the decks for technology, clear the decks for a large write-off to allow the technology support to come in. So following these simple changes, we looked at how could technology help the team engage customers and collect even more debt. Our partnership working across the organisation is also key to supporting the team in its recovery of former tenant debt by ensuring that our colleagues in the operation teams are doing everything they can to keep the debt low and the quality of information high. This gives the former team a better chance at collecting it when it comes across. We work very closely together to ensure that the housekeeping of the accounts are clear and accurate. And to support the technology of the data, it needs to be cleared in the system, as this starts way before the tenancy goes through its termination process. It's around the key information on the customer's circumstances and if they work and where, who's in the property and what are their circumstances, and how does the customer normally make their payments, what are the history of the arrangements, and what patterns does this throw back at us. The process also comes together at the point of the customer handing in the notice to end the tenancy. Both teams engage with each other to ensure the information is correct and accurate, including forwarding address details and contact numbers. At this point, the former tenant teams start to engage that customer around any debt that may be left on the account and start to build that relationship while the customer is still in their tenancy, giving them a much better chance at collecting that debt. So the technology side, when you tell the team you are looking at software and technology, there's always some colleagues who are terrified of the change or even fear that this could result in a job loss. So from the very beginning, I always wanted the team to be involved in what we were doing and feel secure that what we were investing in was to increase their capacity to be able to speak to customers. There's all the clever wording of letters or invoices and technology. It can only get you to engage the customer, but once that happens, it's the person and the colleague on the other end of the phone that ensures the negotiation to secure the payment. I wanted the team to continue to feel valued, but understand that we need to keep striving for better and how we can collect more money with the same resources. So the first piece of software we invested in was back in 2018 with Mobisoft. This piece of technology helps the team have a clear line of sight of the caseload and reduces the number of cases that they need to focus on by removing some into non-contact rules. That's stuff that's waiting to be written off or awaiting trace information. The team can then focus on the priority 1 cases, and that's those customers who are under the notice period. We have found that we are able to engage these and build relationships with them before they leave us. I think it would help us more to see the priority rules in line with the age of the debt, and that comes in line with their internal heat map. When we invested in Voicescape in May 2019 with a go live date of mid-June 2019, that hit us with an absolute huge bang to our income collection. The initial response was massive and received over 400 calls in the first week. The phones were off the hook and the team could not believe what was happening. It was really exciting. I was also glued to that dashboard watching the calls go up and our increased collection rates. That first month was shot up by 32%. By that year, at year end, we'd levelled out at an overall 18% increase on the previous year. As we moved into lockdown though, we stopped collecting the former tenant debt and supported our housing colleagues. By everyone focusing on the current debt, this impacted our former collection rates, so we weren't able to load Voicescape and get those calls coming back in. At week 12, leadership agreed that we could move the team back onto the former debt. And at that point, our weekly collection rates had increased from the previous year, which was £8,700 a week, to £9,500 a week. So how did we do this during a pandemic? So last year, to support the team and continue to make them feel in control of the workload and the calls, we handed over the full access to Voicescape portal to the team. They decided what to load and when to start and pause it. They're able to call back much quicker than waiting for the manager to send them a report for any calls that might have failed or dropped off or that they weren't able to answer quick enough. They're able to pause at that, and then when they're caught back up, they restart the calls again. But most importantly, they feel in control. They are really excited about the calls on the board, and the same way I was that very first week when we just introduced it. They discuss in their team meetings the cases to load and have started to think of better ways of doing things, such as campaigns. They know the targets and achievements and are competitive and excited each month to show that they can always do better. Giving the team full access has also helped with the housekeeping of the contact details. They're able to update the system and the housing management on the calls that are failing. So last year, we also introduced the first robot to our process that is an RPA worker to our income process in the former tenant debt. Our little bot, it now runs through the administration side. It looks for the invoices that need to be sent each day, and it sends them to print and updates the housing management system. So that alone has saved our team 325 hours on just printing alone. We're still working out through this at the company, but it's clear that it definitely saves time on duties that the team can then spend putting more calls through Voicescape and bringing in the income. So what did that achieve? At the year end, we had received over 1.13 million in new former debt during the pandemic. However, we had collected 381k over the 40 weeks. That's 9.5k per week and 33% of the new debt created. But really, the big figure is that we collected 16% of our gross former debt last year. So without making the changes that we did by making our recovery process leaner and investing in the new technology, we would never have been able to reach out to customers like we do without Voicescape. This was the key piece of the puzzle for us. So without this, the team would have had a great lean process with clever technology that told them what to look at, but would have still had the manual bound dialing that was soul breaking for them. So now they're motivated about what calls to load up for the week, as they're only taking calls from customers that they want to engage, and they're able to put their negotiation skills to the test to see how much income they can collect. We have been able to continue recovery action on former debt during the first 12 weeks, and at the rate that we saw that we did collect last year of the 9.5k, we could have achieved in a year in total 495k, which would have been an increase on pre-Voicescape of 29% of our collection rate. So our motivation this year is to hit that target and continue to achieve more. In terms of value for money, we are more efficient than we've ever been with leaner processes and better technology. We are more economic in how we do things, showing an outstanding return on investment. And the outcome has proven that these changes have been the most effective we have seen yet. So what's next for us here? As with everybody else, we're always looking to improve our ways of working and collect more income from former debt. We're currently looking at the impacts of the pandemic on customer debt and how that will move across to the former team. We've seen an increase in debt for our eviction cases, and the first cases we've seen through have had an average of over £7,000 by the time the warrant has been issued. So we are currently discussing different ways of being able to recover this debt and the likelihood and the impact on our bad debt provisions. We're also looking at payment solutions for customers and how to make things better and easier. For example, I like to pay by Apple Pay and use fingerprint or face recognition technology wherever I can, as do many people, including our customers. So we're looking at how can we replicate this for customers and make it easy to make a payment to us. Also, how can we be able to make payments much more easily and quicker back to them? And then how do we incorporate that into My13, which is our customer self-service portal? But one of the big things that we are committed to doing this year is that continued partnership with Voicescape. We have recently completed a behavioural science study and looked at the risks of recovery action and doing something against doing nothing at all, and what action gets a reaction from customers. So following this study, we began working on a very exciting automation project based around those risk principles, but also understanding what the best contact method is for the individual customer and the best time of the day to reach out to them to maximise our opportunity to engage and at what time that suits them, giving you an optimum chance of collecting that payment. The first signs of the project are really exciting, and we're looking forward to going live over the next few weeks with phase 1. So hopefully I will have some more exciting news to share after that date. So I'd just like to thank you for inviting me to discuss this, and happy to answer any questions at the end. If you want to put those into the questions sections, we will come back to you with that. Thanks again for your time.
Hi, I'm Paula Jenner from Citizen Housing, Head of Income, and here to talk to you about former tenant arrears and certainly Citizen's approach to former tenant arrears. As an organisation, we were formed out of 3 legacy organisations that were previously under the same umbrella, September 2019. Just because we were under the same umbrella organisation, it didn't mean that we had one way of doing everything. There were 3 or more, in some cases, approaches to our former tenant arrears recovery. We had no dedicated staff and resource, and because we knew we had more to do with current arrears, this meant that former tenant arrears was far down the priority list of arrears recovery. And I'm sure there's lots of other organisations in the same boat and scratching their heads about kind of where to start with this, because it does feel a little bit daunting. We were daunted too. We had no overview of the debt escalation, particularly the debt breakdown stages. And at that point, we had what I would consider an over-reliance on external debt collection agents. We were referring debt to collection agents without doing anything ourselves before we referred it on to them. And we also had a history of large one-off debt write-off exercises. So we'd done a number of, we'd done that a number of times to kind of clear the decks down, but never really got through the full housekeeping kind of task that was there with the existing debt and how to approach it. So what did we do? Well, we needed a new proactive approach. We knew we needed to make early contact with customers, and so we documented a revised process and procedure, and we ensured that the former tenant arrears work was prioritised on a weekly basis. It wasn't just something that we pick up and drop when we thought we had enough resources. It was something that we wanted to weave through our kind of overall workload. We knew we needed to correctly review every debt to categorise the stage that it was sat at or what we thought we could do with it. We really needed to consider if debt truly was irrecoverable. Were we just progressing write-off actions because of the age of the debt? But we knew, because of the amount of work that we had to progress, that we needed to harness technology in order to make all of the activities efficient as possible. And that's where Voicescape came in, really. So in terms of what does that weekly workload look like, through from June 2020 to June 2021, we started to harness Voicescape to help us with that outbound calling. And over that period, there was over 3,000 attempted outbound calls made specifically around former tenant arrears. Now, customers would engage with those calls directly or ring back later. And the overall call conversion of those was 27%. So 27% of those, over 3,000 calls were customers who then had a conversation with us about that debt. Where a call wasn't connected, voicemails and text messages were progressed, and they had specific former tenant arrears narrative attached to them, being quite clear with the customer about the reason for the call. We did have some early success with cases that hadn't been previously progressed in a proactive manner, where just because we rang and made contact with them, a certain chunk of customers were expecting a call from us at some point and had actually been surprised that we hadn't engaged with them in a more proactive way. So we did have, in the first few months, quite a few little windfalls of customers who settled the entire kind of debt at the point we asked for it, which was quite nice. We had quite a lot of positive feedback from, particularly from staff and from customers. Staff have a clear direction about our approach for former tenant arrears, and they've been involved in the direction of travel for use of Voicescape with our current arrears for our low-level debts, but also watch the progress of how we've deployed the use of that sort of technology. Staff can clearly see the benefits of using technology, so they're not wasting time, going down a list of telephone numbers to make contact with customers. What we're doing is protecting their time so that they engage with a conversation where a customer has actually picked up the call and wants to engage with us. They find it quick and easy to use as a system. It's quite intuitive, and we have a performance dashboard available that shows us the trend and the movement through the workload each week. From a customer's perspective, as I've already mentioned, they, by and large, they were expecting our contact, certainly for some of them, but for others that had their head in their sand, they didn't want to make a payment. They then realised that debt wasn't going to go away, and so we were able to secure quite a lot of agreements out of that. We're also starting to get some customer feedback available via our internal customer excellence platform. Now, we haven't segmented that to separate out the difference between current and former arrears. So it's something on my to-do list going forward, but they're treated the same, and our performance is really, really positive. Customers can give a score out of 5, and by and large our calls come through specifically for income calls at 4.7 to 4.8 on a weekly basis. So we know there's nothing jumping out in terms of customer feedback, even though a chunk of those customers are conversations around paying your old debt. Key performance indicators. Now, when I've listened to any landlord talk about what they've done, the first question I ask is what their performance is. So what I've quoted here is the former tenant arrears performance. But as a little backdrop, what I can tell you is that our current arrears performance dropped by over a full percent at the end of the last financial year compared to the previous year. So, we've really started to see an impact of our whole proactive approach across the board, but particularly looking at former tenant arrears as a percentage of the annual debt. You can see there that there was a massive reduction between 1920 and the end of the financial year 2021. However, that directly links to an increase in the amount of debt that we wrote off as irrecoverable. And so the two go hand in hand, really. But when you look at the percentage of our rent collected, looking at both current and former arrears, again, you can see a real positive direction of travel between the 2 years, but again, can be connected to how much debt we've written off. Now, we don't expect to write that amount of debt off going forward. We expect that figure to kind of even out on a monthly basis now, rather than big one-off write-off exercises going forward. In terms of just a comparison, we know that last financial year we were progressing an awful lot of housekeeping with former tenant debt. We had to recategorise a lot of cases, consider was the debt still recoverable. But from this financial year, we can already start to see a bit of a difference. Comparing last Q1 in the last financial year with this Q1, we've had an increase of 81% in that debt recovery, which equates to 84k. Now, the road ahead is an interesting one, because this year we will have some bigger debts moving across to former tenant arrears. You know, we've seen an increase in evictions so far this quarter, cases that perhaps might have been abandoned, or cases where they needed to progress to eviction, a couple of cases where customers actually were no longer there and had moved abroad, affected by the pandemic perhaps, but we did have some cases where they were carrying high arrears. So it is going to be interesting to see what the trend looks like throughout the rest of this financial year. In terms of the lessons learned, it's quite a few of them. A lot of them you could argue would be kind of gut instinct for those of you working within kind of rent arrears in social housing. Don't let the debt occur in the first place. You know, we conducted audits of new cases, new former tenant arrears cases, and by doing that, by carrying out those audits, we were able to unpick some key areas where we thought we could get tighter. And so now we carry out proactive action at pre-termination wherever possible. So if there's a termination date being entered into the system, you know, for 4 weeks' time, they've given their notice, we will start to make proactive action through that 4-week period to try and minimise the risk of that debt kind of appearing in the first place. Harnessing best practices. There's an HQN toolkit that we found very useful. And at the start of this journey, we kind of wanted to understand, you know, what could we be doing? And the HQN toolkit that's available, you know, on their website looks fairly lengthy when you first look at it, but we found it invaluable, really. And our intention is we'll continue to review that, and hopefully whittle down how many other things we could incorporate into our process. We now ensure that the former tenant arrears workload is progressed on a weekly basis. It's not just when we've got available staffing. We're never in a position where we've got people twiddling their thumbs. I'm sure everybody else is in the same position. And so what we do now is class that as part of our weekly workload, because it's only by doing that that you then attack that work throughout the whole financial year. Customer contact numbers. This sounds really obvious, but they usually remain unchanged. You know their moving address because they've left your property. You know, don't often get a forwarding address to work with. And so when you're posting contacts out, quite often you're not sure that they're still at that property, but telephone numbers remain unchanged. So the use of mobile technology, Voicescape technology or contact technology through telephone numbers, for me, is absolutely got to be the way to go. Largely customers are expecting to be contacted, but also consider the effectiveness and efficiency of processes when you're setting out kind of a new strategy. You know, the Rolls-Royce approach would be to manually attempt to contact every single customer, but we couldn't afford to do that. We knew we didn't have the time to do that. That would detract from our approach to current tenant arrears. So considering, is it effective, but actually is it efficient to take that approach, was really key for us. And I touched on it earlier, progress regular audits. You really need to kind of reflect findings from the audits. Are staff progressing things in the way that you wanted them to? Is there anything you need to tinker with? Is there anything you need to change going forward? And so, you know, we really try to have an iterative approach to that new procedure and process that we set up. and it's been changed a number of times since we set up that original document over a year ago. And we've got some next steps. There's quite a few of them still. You know, we're not where we want to be. It really is a direction of travel. So some of our next steps, you can see them up on the slide there. Considering external debt collection, you know, this isn't a right or a wrong, and a lot of organisations might still use the external debt collection companies. We still do. It's just we try to minimise that activity because we can do some of this debt collection activity ourselves. But also, is there a potential for cases to be referred to court? You know, there is a small claims court that we could still progress cases to, and that could be something that we think about going forward. There's a new best practice Former Tenant Arrears group that we attended recently with 13 group, and the intention is to meet on a quarterly basis to share, you know, what we've made work, what we've tried, and perhaps we don't want to make work going forward. And so it's that best practice group and things like that that we really will enable us to kind of share ideas and embed them in our process going forward. Internally, we use the MIS system, and we know that there's probably a little bit more enhancement that we can do, and we're hoping that over the next couple of months, some of that will have been progressed, which will again just increase the efficiency of staff working with former tenant arrears cases. And we're also hoping to embed a new proactive arrears module within our MIS system, which will give us greater opportunity to highlight high risk cases. And again, this, you know, it's fairly obvious stuff. You know, it's the system being able to kind of pull through cases that really need to be prioritised over other former tenant arrears. And so we think that this new module will help us do that. The use of recurring card payments via AllPay is something that we're hoping to get embedded within the next month. And for customers who perhaps don't want to sign up to a direct debit because of potential bank charges, if they haven't got the funds to meet the direct debit, this payment option could be a solution for them. And basically will just save them the time and expense of calling up to make a payment over the phone each week, which again would increase efficiencies for us, but kind of secures that payment going forward unless the transaction can't be covered by their funds. We do anticipate a reduction in our external debt agent charges because we're doing more recovery action ourselves. So we haven't yet realised that, but we're hoping over this financial year that we will certainly see a reduction in that. And we're hoping, obviously, that our recovery arrears will increase and that will secure a bigger recovery over the next 2 years. But like everything in income at the moment, it's continually evolving, and because we've had a little pot of cases that have been evicted with quite high arrears, you know, we're going to just have to keep a watching brief on that. But we do know that we've got our cases into the best possible position they can be in terms of the trigger points that they're at and the process that we're currently following. So really, we know we're still not the best that we can be. We know we've got more work to do, but we're really proud of the investment we've put into it, particularly over the last financial year. So it's just a watch and brief to see what that leads to. Thank you for listening. I hope it's provided some information of interest and kind of open to anybody who kind of wants to speak to me separately or fire away with any questions. Thank you very much.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you so much to Chris, to Caroline and to Paula. I think you'll all agree, some fascinating case studies and use studies there. So we've had a number of questions. We've also got the results of the polls. So I'm just going to dive into the poll section quickly. We asked a couple of questions, and most people have responded, which is great to see. So the first question we asked was, how challenging compared to this year, to last year, do you anticipate 2022 to be for collecting? Overwhelming majority saying more challenging. And I think when we look at things like furlough coming to an end, when we look at anticipated unemployment rising, we look at the cost of housing and electrical bills going up, and people going back to work, we're starting to see all of those building up to a much more challenging picture. So 68% of you felt there'd be more challenging, 32% equally challenging, and nobody, no surprise there, anticipating it to be less challenging. And the second poll, your current biggest challenge for collecting FTA. Again, a lot of people voting on this. So 60% of people saying their biggest challenge is not having enough resource, and 40% saying that the biggest challenge is difficult to get hold of former tenants. Both huge challenges. And I think that Paula and Caroline talked to how Voicescape supports those challenges for them. So do continue to poll if you've not done that already. We'll publish the results on social media. It'd be great to see how that evolves over time. But a number of questions. So I will shortly invite Paula and Caroline to join in. But there's lots of people have sent me a message saying, how does Voicescape actually work? What does it actually do? So I've actually got a very quick slide that I'm just going to share with you very quickly. Bear with me 2 moments. So hopefully you can all now see, my screen. So what does Voicescape actually do? There are a number of reasons throughout a tenancy that you might want to engage with a tenant, all sorts of reasons, none more so than those in rent collection, trying to speak to people about failed direct debits, UC verification, just missed payments, and you can't see my screen. I've just been told. Sorry, it would help if I actually, share. Sorry about that. Hopefully now if I hit that, hopefully you can see my screen. So as I was saying, there's a number of reasons that you might wish to engage with a tenant throughout their tenancy. For example, failed direct debits, UC verification, wanting to take a payment, or chasing former tenants. What does Voicescape do? Well, we will take your FTA debt list, and we can take that from any housing management system, any finance platform, or something like RentSense that Caroline talked to earlier. And what we'd do, we would start engaging with your former tenants. And there's a number of scenarios, a number of outcomes. The first is they answer the phone and they hear a pre-recorded message, something like, hello, this is your landlord, Hudson Housing. We need to speak with you about how your rent is paid and can help you today. Please press 1 to speak with an officer now. This call is free of charge. Something like that, or perhaps something more suited to a former debt. And at this point, what we're hoping is that they press 1 and transfer through to your officer. That's an ideal scenario, but as we know, that's not always going to happen. So in a second scenario where maybe somebody has missed that call, what we'd do, Voicescape would leave a voicemail asking them to call back, and it would also send them a text message asking them to call back. And when they do call back, the system recognizes that's Mrs. Smith, it's a former tenant debt, send her through to the FTA team, and at that point, they're connected with your officer. The third scenario is where we're demonstrating a bit more persistence, where maybe we've tried to call somebody, we've left a voicemail, we've left a text message, and they've not rung back. What Voicescape would then do is try them again tomorrow. And it would try them and it would keep trying them until we're able to engage with them. So it's being positively persistent, ultimately connecting with your officer. Now, the good news for your team here is that they're engaged with former tenants, looking to set up direct debits, looking to set up arrangements, looking to take payments. But all they've done is answer the phone to people that have elected to have that conversation. They're not doing any of that manual outbound engagement that that Paula and Caroline talked about being such a hindrance to positive payments. So, you know, the net result of all of that is huge operational efficiency. So when we look on the polls at people telling us their biggest challenges are not having enough resource and it being difficult, well, this Voicescape FTA collection service really supports that notion of driving operational efficiencies, making sure that your officers are engaged in those value-added conversations. And that's all they're doing, really. They're adding value. They're not hindered by manual non-value-added activities. We're maximizing the impact of those calls. connecting them with huge amounts of tenants. I think Caroline will correct me if I'm wrong here, but I'm sure that they increased their engagement levels by about 400% when Voicescape turned on. And as a result of that, we're supporting the mental health and well-being of staff. You know, a lot of them working at home right now, they've not got the camaraderie of the team around them, and we're not, and they haven't got now to do all of those soul-destroying manual tasks. So I'm sure that Caroline and Paula will talk to a lot of those points shortly. Just as a little point here, some of the many RSLs that we work with some ALMOs, some housing associations, some local authorities, some very large, some very small, using all housing management systems, using all types of predictive analytics tools, all telephony platforms that you can think of under the sun. We are data and system agnostic. So what I'd suggest is that if anyone does want to engage with us, then Mohammed will pop my contact details in the chat, please, Mohammed. And if anyone wants to get in touch with me to see how we might be able to support you, then do so. But I'll stop sharing my screen. Hopefully that's answered that question. If I dive back in here, there was also another question. Lots of people asking about Caroline's best practice group. We'll email the details of those out to you so that Caroline can add you all en masse to that group. The second question, we've got one from Alex at Barnet and Jane asking exactly the same question. Can you use this system with current tenant arrears? The short answer is yes. In fact, all of our customers do, including Citizen and 13. It's exactly the same. But today we're just focusing on former tenant arrears, but it's just as impactful with current tenant arrears. So we've got some great use cases. But again, I'd just recommend get in touch with me. Mohammed's going to pop a link in where you can book some time in my diary to see how we can specifically support you. Third question here around resources required for former tenant arrears collections and how many resources do they have. So I don't know whether we can get Caroline and Paula back on the call with me there to answer those questions, but I know that, oh yeah, they're just coming in now. Here's Paula and here's Caroline. Caroline, can you talk to how many people you've got working with former tenant arrears on your team?
Yeah, sure. So I've got 2 FTA focused on former debt itself. I've got 4 in the team that focuses on debt in my team. I also manage the court team for possession hearings and court orders, which is separate to that. But focused on debt, I've got 2 in former and 2 on other debt, which is our corporate debt and our bespoke current debt, like our shared owners or our leaseholders. When we turn Voicescape on the first day, we generally have the whole team picking up those calls. But that's in your control as to how many advisors you set that out and how fast you want the calls to run through. So you can keep control of that as well.
Fantastic. And just to give people an idea of scale, you've got 2 people dedicated on former tenant arrears. What's the stock size at 13, Caroline?
We've got 34,000 properties in general needs, but we collect all former debt. So that's over 40,000 properties we have, including all our bespoke products. So we collect former debt for everything.
Wow, fantastic. And Paula, yourself, can you answer the same question around resources? What have you got on former tenants?
Yeah, it's similar to Caroline, actually. Two FTEs on former tenant debt, but they're not the only ones taking the calls that are coming through. So we have a proactive team that deal with the low-level arrears, and the former tenant calls coming through are spread across all of those officers. But the 2 that are dedicated on former tenant arrears are then picking up the admin outside of taking those low calls. So the volume of staff on those calls really fluctuates dependent on our kind of, staffing any one week on that team. But we're keen to do that so that we weren't just reliant on those 2 officers and spread the knowledge throughout the team, really. But it's been a bit of a learning curve for the team because by and large they weren't, they weren't all doing anything with former tenant arrears prior to that. In terms of stock size, we're 32,000 property stock, a mixture of leasehold, shared ownership, supported housing, the full raft IMRs of housing stock, but the majority or the lion's share of that is general needs housing, and we've got a massive mix of rural, semi-rural, and city centre locations. particularly in the Coventry area, you know, when we've got a huge number of high-rise, and there's over, I think it's about 33 high-rise that we have in the Coventry location. So you name it, we've got that type of housing stock within the group.
Brilliant. And one of the other questions that a lot of people have been asking around is home working, and I know you've both got home working teams. And can you just talk to how that works across office and home working, Caroline?
So here at 13, we've all been given a designated job role, whether you're a home worker or whether you're a roaming worker. So for my team, we sit in the finance directorate and we have been classed as home working. So we don't need to be out and about or in the office environment. However, our housing colleagues that collect the current debt are roam workers. So they will be based at a hub. So it could be a community centre, it could be one of their touch points or the office. Depending on what they need to be doing that day. For the respect to former tenant debt, that's all managed at home. So everything I've spoken about today is from working from home. We have one member of the team that goes into the office and does our printing for us. That's the only part of the technology we've yet to figure out and sort out the printing and automation of that.
And yourself, Paula? How's the home working, office working situation at the moment?
Oh.
No, I think we've lost Paula there. Okay. Marlon's just asked a question around unobtainable numbers and mobiles. So one of the great in fact, I'm going to ask Caroline to answer that about invalid numbers and how Voicescape supports that.
Yeah, so this was one of the reasons that we give the team control of the Voicescape portal, because what they're able to see on a daily basis are the numbers that are invalid. So they can use that to clean up the system, and they'll check if it's an actual invalid number or whether they've blocked us or whatever reason, you know, it's not running through the Voicescape system. So we use that data to clean up our system. Customers also don't always ring you back on the number that you've rang them on. So Voicescape can't recognise it coming back into the system and take it out of your call log, but it does know that it's coming via that route. So you get a different number that will come up in your Hunt group screen. So what we've done is we've created an action code in the system to log those numbers separately, because they are replying as a result of a Voicescape message or text. They just either don't have any credit on their phone or whatever, and are unable to ring you back, so they're using somebody else's number. So what we see in our dash, we've also got this volume of customers that are coming back through a different route because they either don't want to use that number or they've got no credit on their phone. Usually that's the answer for it. So there is a big gain and a big advantage to letting your team manage that portal, because the cleanup of your data that it will give you is huge. I can see Paula's back and she'll probably agree with me with that.
Yeah, completely. It's probably the first 6 weeks of using Voicescape, it really made us look at the kind of how cases were categorized, in terms of which cases it kind of pulled through. I missed the question at the beginning, but just going back to when we put Voicescape in, it was December 19 that we went live with it, but we didn't really start actively using it for Voicescape until some months later than that. So the staff were building on already having been sold on the benefits of Voicescape before we actually started using it for the former tenant arrears. It kind of just looking at the overall performance, we shaved a full % off our kind of general, not generally, it's our overall current arrears total in the last full financial year. So through that pandemic period, using, we think that the lion's share of that really is down to making proactive contact and gradually increasing how effective, how many engagements we can put through, putting more workload through the Voicescape and gradually building on that. Has been a kind of a real success for us. I certainly wouldn't want to stop using that calling technology to get the best efficiencies out of our internal resources. But yeah, as Caroline said about data, your data is key. It's only as good as the information you feed through into the system, really. So we're continually looking at new areas to put through it. One we're looking at the moment is where we've just served a notice seeking possession. So that that month or 2 months, you know, or we know it's evolved quite a bit over the last year, is then utilising Voicescape to make contact with them. So really, we're using it wherever we want to get hold, you know, with a customer and hold a conversation where we think it can make a difference to our overall performance or engagement with the tenant to drive the right behaviour, really. I think I'm just wondering if there was any other questions that we hadn't.
I'm not sure whether Paula, I can't hear anyone at the moment. I'm really sorry.
Okay. There was a question there,
but
Paula.
just to wrap up, I think we're approaching 3 o'clock, guys. So I'm going to try and I don't know if anyone can see or hear me at the moment. So I'm going to wrap things up. We're going to send out all of the contact details for Caroline and Paula if you wanted to engage them directly. We're going to send a recording of today's session and details of the best practice group that Caroline's kindly set up for us. My contact details are in the chat that Mohammed's popped there. So if anyone wants to make direct contact, by all means, I'd love to speak to you. Thank you, Carol. You can hear and see me. That's good to hear. But it's been my absolute pleasure. It's been a fascinating hour with you all. I hope you found it of value, and really appreciate you all spending the time joining us today. Thanks. Take care. Bye now.